Hello again, welcome back. Well, as fighting between Shia militia and Iraqi government forces spreads through Iraq, it'll be an enormous task to quell the violence. What are the options? While its ability to defeat the insurgency on its own can't be assured, Iraq's army has so far refused to call on its US allies to intervene. On the other hand, many analysts believe it's only a matter of time before British forces are back on the streets of Basra. Control was handed to Iraqi forces in December, and the British withdrew to a base outside the city. Another possibility is integrating the militias with Iraq's security forces. But fierce opposition from Iraq's Sunnis would be inevitable. They accuse the militias of torture and murder, and with militia groups set on destroying each other, it's a strategy that seems doomed to fail. The other option, dividing the country, but that's likely only to throw the region into deeper crisis. Still joining us are our guests. They're both in London. Sabah Al-Mukhtar, he's a UK-based Iraqi expert, and CRISPIAN CUSS, he's a security expert and former officer of the British Army that served in Iraq. Now, let's pick up on that point about breaking up the country. Mr. Al-Mukhtar, is that still an option?
Well, the Americans have floated the idea by the Congress and the Senate, issuing a declaration at the time that the country was to be divided. The Americans said this is not a binding decision, but nevertheless, this is the indication of the American policy as one of the options. I think the Americans have been experimenting with Iraq from zero day. They don't have any particular plan. They keep on thinking that they can run the show, but in fact they can't. Even now, when one looks at the situation of the fighting between the militias, one of the public relations exercises, we are calling it a fight between one militia and the army. In fact, it's a fight between three militias. Two of them are wearing khaki and the third one is not. The Americans and the British cannot interfere, in fact, in a guerrilla warfare, because this is not what armies are made to do. The situation that the government, the Americans installed there, they know it is incapable of running the show. They don't want to hand the Iraq back to the Iraqis rather than the Iraqis that the Americans have chosen. The Americans still believe that they are talking about a political settlement and a political process, and they are still talking about a liberation and democracy, as we heard President Bush 3 days ago.
Let's go back to that political process. Is a peace deal now possible between MOOTADA al-SADR and the government? What can the government offer?
Most certainly there is. MOOTADA al-SADR wants to play a more important role than he is allowed at the present moment. The Americans from the beginning, they didn't want MOOTADA al-SADR to play a role because they fell into the trap that MOOTADA was representing Iran, where in fact the Americans went into bed with the Islamic Council and with the Dawah party, who are in fact the Iranian-backed authorities. MOOTADA al-SADR, unless he is given a little more role to play, or his movement, there will be no solution between the government, which is the militia, the two militias, and MOOTADA al-SADR.
Okay, Mr. CUSS, with al-SADR distancing himself from the rogue elements within the MEHDI army, is he saying to the Americans, go in now, you can take them out, now that I'm no longer part of that?
I don't think he's saying that to the Americans, and MOOTADA al-SADR has always been very against the American presence in any form. He's refused to have any part of government with them. This is quite a for the Iraqi government have got to understand how critical it is for them to sort this out. I mean, everything is really dependent on how they deal with this over the next few days. Whether Iraq has any short or medium-term stable future, or whether actually it's just going to be chaos for the next few years. I'm not sure the government really realises the significance of the situation they're in right now.
But the key to this surely must be what to do with the militias, and a lot of Iraqis themselves rely on these militias. They don't trust the police or the army, and they know that a lot of these militias are capable of looking after them.
That's absolutely right. And earlier you were talking about, is Iraq going to divide into three? Well, it hasn't happened yet, but local security in terms of local security, that really is the case. The north, obviously, what's called Kurdistan, the Kurds have been looking after themselves for some time. Out in the Al-Anbar province, the Sunnis have been responsible for ensuring their own security. And in the south, the militias and both the police and to a lesser extent the military, they do sort of merge and weave in together. And so to a degree, security has already been handed over to the various factional elements.
Mr. Al-Mukhtar, let's say with the militias, 3 years ago, Parliament passed a law disbanding all militias. The Badr Brigade was taken into the army, but not the MEHDI army. What was behind that?
Well, behind that, because the Al-Hakim family does not want Al-SADR family to play any role in the politics. Muqtada al-Sadr, right from the outset, he wanted to play a role. He, as a matter of fact, the beginning, he took a position against the Americans because he wanted recognition from the Americans, and he was looking at it that he has suffered under the previous regime, he suffered under the wars of Kuwait and the sanctions and the regime, while the other ones were enjoying themselves in Iran and in Saudi Arabia, and they came and took over, including those who were imported from Britain and other countries. So Muqtada al-Sadr wanted to play a role. He was not allowed. He wants now to play a role. And unless they allow him somehow to integrate into the process, both political and military, there will be no solution. But the problem is that he does not have a group of people who are organized enough or who are under his proper control to be integrated.
What about the British Army as a possible option, Mr. CUSS? Your Foreign Secretary David Miliband said that British troops retain the capacity to intervene in the city, talking about BASRA here, in the case of a breakdown of order. Is the appetite there for that sort of action?
I don't think it really matters whether the appetite's there or not. What really matters is the numbers involved. At the moment, there are about 4,100 British soldiers based just outside of BASRA. Now, when you consider all the tasks they have to do for their own protection, looking after their camps, providing security for the convoys, and then take into other factors that some of them are doctors, some are in charge of administration, logistics, actually, they could probably deploy about 600 to 800 troops on the ground. Now, that's probably enough for a good, short, sharp battle on the streets, but it's certainly not enough to take control of BASRA. What you might see them do is work alongside the Iraqi forces as advisors, as they have done in the past. But the idea that the British Army could re-establish control of BASRA is completely unrealistic.
Was it the right decision for the British Army to withdraw from BASRA? Would this have happened if they'd remained?
They had to withdraw. Simply, there wasn't the political appetite within the UK to keep the required number of British forces in BASRA, which have allowed them to control the city. When you've only got 4,000 troops on the ground, there's very little you could do. They couldn't even control the palace and their base they've got at the moment. They withdrew from the palace earlier in the year, and realistically, all they can do at the moment is look after themselves and some training.
Mr. Al-Mukhtar, what does all this do for national reconciliation in the country? Is it something that's going to be ignored now with these ongoing battles, or is there a greater need for it?
No, there is a greater need for it, but not for the intervention of the British Army or the American Army, because in this instance, the intervention from the British or the Americans will be seen certainly as these powers have also become part of the militias. We already have 3-4 different militias, including the Sahwa and the various things. So if now we have the Americans and the British siding with one militia against another, and it doesn't matter whether the militia is wearing khaki fatigue or not, because at the end of the day, the Iraqis know that all of them are in fact militias. So the intervention wouldn't be helpful. The second point is that what is the point of keeping the British soldiers in Iraq when in fact all what they are doing is exposing themselves to danger and only trying to protect themselves. So they are not even playing the role of a protector or an occupier.
Okay, Mr. Sabah Al-Mukhtar, thank you so much for your thoughts, and you too, Mr. CRISPIAN, CUSS, both in London. And as always, thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.